We are often provided with numerous different training and nutrition recommendations for muscle growth. However, it can be difficult to know exactly how important each factor is for long-term muscle growth. So, in this video, we will cover which factors related to training, nutrition, and recovery are most and least important for building muscle mass over time. The first and most important consideration for muscle growth is training adherence and consistency. This refers to sticking to your training routine over time without major deviations or extended periods away from lifting. The reason this is the most important factor for muscle growth is because it takes a long time to develop significant muscle mass. We are talking about a multi-month and multi-year time frame, not a few days or weeks. This is important to understand because the training and nutrition practices we implement should be conducive with our lifestyle. This may sometimes even mean that certain variables are sacrificed slightly to promote adherence to the routine. Because even if we do everything else perfectly, we most likely won't achieve significant results if it is not performed consistently over time. So no matter what recommendations are made, lifters should ensure that it doesn't sacrifice your ability to stick with the training plan long term. So assuming we are training consistently over time, the next most important factor regarding muscle growth is effort. Effort is basically how hard we train. More specifically, there are two primary variables contributing to training effort: intensity and volume. These seem to be the two most impactful training variables responsible for stimulating muscle growth. First, let's cover intensity. In the context of hypertrophy training, intensity refers to proximity to failure, meaning how close to failure each set is taken. In general, intensity seems to follow this hypothetical relationship with hypertrophy. Not training close enough to failure is simply not really enough to stress the muscle to stimulate much muscle growth. Then, as we train closer to failure, we stress the muscle enough to induce significant adaptation. However, once we train very close to failure, there seems to be diminishing returns for the last few reps of the set. So we need to train at least fairly close to failure to promote any appreciable amount of muscle growth. In practical terms, we probably want to train with at least around 5 reps in reserve or less to induce significant growth. Next, let's discuss volume. Volume in the context of hypertrophy training refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week, assuming they are being trained with sufficient intensity. The volume hypertrophy relationship hypothetically looks something like this. More volume seems to result in a faster rate of muscle growth, but once again, there are diminishing returns. So as we perform more volume, we probably achieve less additional muscle growth. So essentially, we need to make sure we are performing enough volume to stimulate muscle growth. However, it is difficult to know exactly how much volume is enough because there can be substantial variability between lifters. The general guidelines suggest that around 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week is a decent average guide to promote great muscle growth, but some lifters may require more or less than this range. These two variables make up what we call training effort. In general, more effort probably results in greater gains over time, but more importantly, there is a minimum amount of effort required for muscle growth to occur. Without enough effort, we simply won't provide enough stress to disrupt homeostasis, and ultimately won't stimulate significant muscle growth. So even if all your other training variables are implemented perfectly, they won't have any impact if effort levels are not sufficient. The next most important factor on our list are the primary nutrition variables, calories and protein. Once muscle growth is stimulated via resistance training, calories and protein provide the raw materials for muscle tissue to be built. If we don't have sufficient calories and protein available, then we don't have the raw resources to develop muscle mass. Let's now cover each of these nutrition variables individually. First is our total daily calorie intake. Essentially, for muscle growth to occur, we need to meet some sort of minimum calorie requirement. If calorie intake is not sufficient, we may simply not provide enough resources or energy to build muscle tissue, even if we provide an effective training stimulus. Thankfully, most people in the developed modern world consume enough food to be in a healthy state, so this minimum requirement isn't really much of an issue. However, it can inhibit muscle growth if we attempt to maintain too low of a body fat for too long. Trying to chronically stay below your lower intervention point is probably not going to be favourable for muscle growth. This refers to the lowest body fat that you can maintain with healthy physiological function. So essentially, the main consideration for calorie intake is making sure you aren't staying excessively lean for long periods of time by eating very low relative calories. Furthermore, beyond these minimum calorie requirements, we are more so talking about our relative energy balance. In other words, whether we are eating in a surplus, deficit, or at maintenance. While muscle growth can be achieved in all three energy balance states, they are not all equally effective. A surplus is likely to result in the largest magnitude of muscle growth. Maintenance calories are second best, and a calorie deficit will result in the least muscle growth, if any at all. And the other primary nutrition consideration regarding muscle growth is our total daily protein intake. Protein provides the raw amino acids required for muscle tissue synthesis. So once again, we require enough protein in our diet for new muscle tissue to be built. Although similar to calories, most people in the modern developed world consume enough protein in their everyday diet to support muscle growth from resistance training, even without conscious effort. However, to maximize muscle growth, higher protein intakes may be additionally beneficial. Similar to volume, we generally find that total daily protein intake follows a diminishing returns relationship with muscle growth. This means that more protein probably results in superior muscle growth, but there is less additional benefit with higher and higher intakes. The research tends to find that the threshold where significant diminishing returns exist is around 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So as a practical guide, trainees probably want to try and hit around this minimum protein target to maximize muscle growth. These two dietary variables seem to be the most important when it comes to nutrition for muscle growth. However, they are ranked below the primary training variables because nutrition is not something that stimulates muscle growth, it simply supports muscle growth. So without a training stimulus, manipulating these nutrition variables aren't going to do much. Next on our hierarchy, I have grouped together all secondary training variables. This basically refers to all other training variables other than volume and intensity. This includes factors such as rep ranges, exercise selection, frequency, rest periods, lifting technique, and more. While manipulating these variables can have a notable influence on muscle growth, they simply aren't as important as training with enough effort and eating enough food. This is because muscle growth is a very forgiving adaptation, which can be achieved using a large range of different methods. Muscle growth can be achieved across a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads, using multiple different exercises, with shorter and longer rest periods, and much more variation. Yes, there are ways to manipulate these variables to maximize muscle growth, and I think it is certainly worth doing so, but these variables will barely have much of an effect if we aren't training with sufficient effort. As a quick summary, some of these secondary variables can be manipulated in the following way to maximize muscle growth. For rep ranges, training anywhere between around 5 to 30 reps can induce similar muscle growth, provided that we are training close to failure. Exercise selection should be individualized to what provides each lifter with the best perceived stimulus for a particular muscle group. And exercises which stress the muscle at longer lengths tend to be slightly more hypertrophic. In terms of frequency, when total weekly volume is equated, the number of times a muscle is trained per week doesn't seem to have any major impact on muscle growth. But there does seem to be a small advantage to training each muscle at least twice per week rather than only once per week. Slightly longer interset rest periods seem to be slightly superior compared with shorter rest periods for compound lifts, but there doesn't seem to be as much difference for isolation lifts. And lifts should generally be performed with strict technique with a controlled eccentric tempo, using full range of motion or partials at long muscle lengths. Furthermore, these variables are subject to high individual variability. Trainees should start with these general recommendations and individualize from there. This should be based on your individual anatomy and physiology, and also what works best from a practical perspective. The next factor on our hierarchy is sleep and stress management. In general, the assumption is that we want to ensure we are getting enough good quality sleep, and we want to minimize external stress unrelated to training to maximize anabolic activity. Although this makes logical sense, and there is plenty of evidence supporting these phenomena for general health and well-being, the direct effects on muscle growth are less clear. This is mostly because there is very little well-controlled data looking at the effects of sleep or stress on muscle growth outcomes from a resistance training program. From the little evidence we have, poor sleep and high emotional stress do appear to inhibit muscle growth to some extent. So from what we know, promoting good overall sleep habits and minimizing external stress do seem to be somewhat important when it comes to building muscle. Furthermore, there is potential that sleep and stress could be a higher priority on the list, but we need more evidence before making this claim. However, I think the biggest influence that managing our sleep and stress has for long-term muscle growth is due to its effects on our number one priority, adherence and consistency. As we know, poor sleep and high stress does have a significant negative effect on mood, emotional state, motivation, cognitive function, and much more. These are all likely to negatively impact our ability to stay consistent with a training and nutrition routine long term. When we are tired or stressed, we have a reduced likelihood of completing our regular training routine and making good food choices. And if we do manage to stick to our training schedule, the effort levels are likely to be lower. While we all experience some amount of sleep restriction and emotional stress at certain times, it is more about the overall experience over the long term. Small amounts of stress and a few nights of poor sleep here and there are not going to be much of an issue in the long term, but chronic sleep deprivation and excessive emotional stress are likely to significantly interfere with training and nutrition practices. So for these reasons, I think it is definitely an important consideration to appropriately manage your sleep and stress to maximize muscle growth. Now getting into the less important factors for muscle growth, I have grouped together secondary nutrition variables as the next factor on our hierarchy. This is basically everything else apart from our total daily calorie and protein intakes. This includes variables such as meal timing, protein frequency, carb versus fat ratios, protein quality, micronutrients, and much more. Simply put, as long as our calorie and protein intakes are appropriate and we are providing a good training stimulus, none of these factors seem to have a major impact on muscle growth. Yes, manipulating them can have a small effect over time, but nowhere near to the same magnitude as our first few considerations on the hierarchy. As a practical guide, here are some general recommendations to follow for best practice regarding these secondary nutrition variables. Try to consume around 3 to 5 meals per day with a solid protein serving with each meal. Try to fairly evenly spread these meals throughout the day and around resistance training. Once protein targets are met, you want to consume a minimum of around 0.5 grams per kilogram per day of fat and a minimum of around 2 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrates, but the exact proportion of fats versus carbs in your diet after meeting these minimum requirements don't seem to make all that much difference. In terms of protein quality, animal-based foods tend to contain a greater proportion of essential amino acids compared with plant-based foods. However, from various foods in the overall diet, even an entirely plant-based diet will likely provide enough essential amino acids to promote great muscle growth. And lastly, micronutrients don't seem to have any notable direct influence on muscle growth, but they are certainly important for general health. This is important for long-term consistency and adherence to training. Moving on to our second least important factor for muscle growth, I have chosen supplements. While supplements can have a small positive effect on muscle growth in some cases, they simply aren't that effective. Without solid training and nutrition practices, supplements simply won't really do anything. However, if you were taking meticulous care of all the other factors so far on this list, then some supplements may have a small benefit. In reality, most supplements don't have much solid evidence to support them for muscle growth, although there are a small handful which have been proven to be somewhat effective. Let's briefly cover some of the well-known supplements that can be beneficial for hypertrophy training. Creatine can be an effective supplement to improve max strength and repetition strength. This can be beneficial for hypertrophy training as it may allow us to lift slightly heavier weights or perform slightly more reps per set on average. This can promote a slightly superior hypertrophy stimulus, which can benefit long-term muscle growth. Protein powders can be a convenient way to increase your total daily protein intake. There doesn't seem to be anything inherently special about protein powders. They are more going to be helpful for convenience. For some people, this may be useful, while others may prefer consuming protein entirely from food. Caffeine seems to be performance enhancing when taken in large doses of around 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram, which is equivalent to around 2 to 5 cups of coffee in a single sitting for most people. This can result in slightly increased lifting performance, which can then promote a superior hypertrophy stimulus, similar to how creatine can be beneficial. However, this is unrealistic for most people to consume before each workout. Instead, low doses of caffeine are probably more appropriate because they are enough to enhance cognitive function, alertness, concentration, and mood with as little as around 0.5 milligrams per kilogram. I think this is where caffeine can have a more useful benefit, as this small dose can help us concentrate on our workout and promote sufficient effort. There are a few other supplements that can potentially be beneficial for muscle growth, but I think these are the three most useful. And finally, our least important factor for muscle growth is the collective group of secondary recovery modalities. This is quite vague, but it basically refers to any forms of recovery apart from sleep and stress management. This includes methods such as massage, ice baths, compression garments, and more. These recovery methods may be slightly more important for sports performance training as they can reduce soreness and perceived fatigue and increase readiness to train. This is good for athletes who need to train or compete almost every day and be in the best possible condition. However, it is not the same when it comes to muscle growth. When it comes to hypertrophy, we want to stress the muscle, disrupt homeostasis, and allow the body to recover and adapt. And we usually have multiple days before the muscle is trained again to allow this recovery process. It may be possible for some of these recovery methods to speed up this process slightly, but readiness and recovery times aren't really what limits muscle growth, so they probably aren't really doing anything beneficial. Furthermore, trying to speed this process up can actually inhibit muscle growth in some cases. For example, it has been shown that post-training cold water therapies such as ice baths actually blunt hypertrophy. This is thought to be a result of the cold water limiting swelling and inflammation, which interferes with the recovery and adaptation process. So on one hand, these recovery methods can improve readiness to train to some extent, but this isn't really necessary for hypertrophy training because muscle growth is a structural adaptation, not a performance outcome. And in some cases, this may actually be deleterious for muscle growth. Now that we have covered the general hierarchy of which factors are most and least effective for muscle growth, there is one last concept that is important to understand, and this is that most factors will influence other factors on the hierarchy. So even though one variable may not have a large influence on muscle growth directly, it may still be important by indirectly influencing other factors. We covered an example of this regarding sleep and stress. While it is not entirely clear how large of an effect these factors have on muscle growth directly, they are certainly important to promote adherence and consistency to training. Another example of this may be manipulating some secondary training variables such as exercise selection. Implementing exercises that you enjoy will likely promote greater long-term adherence and consistency to the training program, and may result in training with greater effort, which are the two most important factors on our list. So just be aware that no factor works in complete isolation. Each variable influences other factors on the list, which could have a larger indirect effect on long-term muscle growth. So what does all of this information mean practically for us? Well, essentially, this hierarchy can be used to determine how much time, effort, and focus we put into any given training, nutrition, or recovery protocol. We want to prioritize the factors that have the highest importance, such as training adherence and consistency, and effort. And if we don't have the time or willingness to take care of every minute detail related to muscle growth, then we don't need to worry too much about the factors which have a lower importance, such as supplements or additional recovery modalities. Trainees can use this general hierarchy as a guide for where we want to allocate the most and least time and effort. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.